I remembered the smell of burning hair when the Geller field fluctuated. 47 seconds of exposure to the Amatorium's edge, and rating third-class Marcus Holand's scalp ignited from the inside out, his skull glowing like a forge-lit coal before his consciousness fled screaming into the void. The temperature on the bridge spiked to 53 degrees Celsius during those 47 seconds, and I watched the chronometer because focusing on numbers kept me from focusing on the screaming. I was 22 years old, had served aboard the Imperial Navy frigate Undaunting Resolve for 4 years, and I genuinely believed that Marcus's death represented the worst horror I would ever witness. I believed the Imperium's propaganda about our ship's sanctity, about the Emperor's protection extending through blessed bulkheads and consecrated machine spirits. I believed that if death came for us, it would arrive as void-cold silence or the merciful instant of a torpedo's detonation. I was wrong about everything. When the Chaos Space Marines boarded us 6 weeks later, they taught me what terror actually meant. They taught all 8,000 of us, though only 2,000 lived long enough to truly understand the lesson. My name is Matthias Kren. I need to anchor myself to that fact, because everything that happened afterward tried to strip it away, to reduce me from a person with a name and a history into a statistic, a casualty figure, a data point in some distant administratum ledger that would record our ship's loss with the emotional weight of an accounting error. I came from Hive Tertius on Scintilla, from the mid-levels where the recycled air tasted of Promethean residue and the constant hum of plasma generators provided the only lullaby anyone ever knew. My mother worked in a textile manufactory for 36 years before her lungs finally surrendered to the chemical fog that pervaded every breath. My father I never knew, lost to some war on some world whose name meant nothing to me. When the press gang came through our district, I was 17 and stupid enough to think that naval service represented opportunity rather than merely a different form of grinding servitude. The Undaunting Resolve was a sword-class frigate, 90 years old, stretched 1.6 kilometers from prow to stern, and home to 8,000 souls who maintained her systems, loaded her weapons, monitored her reactors, and prayed to machine spirits that were probably just degraded logic circuits wrapped in millennia of superstition. I served in the lower decks as part of the engineering complement, not important enough to touch the sacred reactors, but trusted enough to maintain the secondary plasma conduits that fed power to the portside lance batteries. My world consisted of crawl spaces barely wide enough for my shoulders, heat that averaged 42 degrees in the coolest compartments, and the constant smell of ozone mixed with machine oil that had been blessed by tech priests who chanted in binary and touched nothing without ritual. We had been in the warp for 16 weeks, traveling between the Calixi sector and Scarus sector, with dispatches too sensitive for astropathic transmission and too urgent for standard courier vessels. I never learned what those dispatches contained. In the Imperial Navy, information flows upward through the ranks like water through a filter, and by the time it reaches ratings like me, only meaningless sludge remains. We knew our course. We knew our destination. We knew that Captain Aldrich Vaughan had served for 43 years and never lost a ship. We knew that our Geller field generators had been blessed during the last port call. That our navigator came from a house with 7,000 years of genetic purity, that our auger arrays could detect warp signatures at ranges that would give us hours of warning before any threat materialized. We knew nothing that mattered. The transition from warp to real space happened during my sleep cycle. In the narrow coffin bunk I shared with rating second-class Jens Markway on alternate shifts. The sensation of reality snapping back into proper dimensions woke me as it always did, a moment of profound wrongness in the gut, like falling and catching yourself simultaneously. The ship's systems registered the translation with a deep thrumming that resonated through every bulkhead, a sound you felt in your bones rather than heard with your ears. I had experienced this hundreds of times. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing to suggest that we had emerged into our doom. I pulled myself from the bunk, dressed in the same grease-stained coveralls I had worn for 6 weeks, and made my way through corridors lit by sodium lamps that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. The ship's morning cycle had already begun. I could hear the change of watch bells clanging through the Vox system, the shuffled footsteps of thousands of crew moving to their stations, the grinding of elevator platforms that carried ratings between decks, the smell of corpse starch rations wafted from the crew galleys, that particular combination of recycled protein and chemical preservatives that sat heavy in your stomach and provided exactly enough nutrition to keep you functional. I had eaten it every day for 4 years and had stopped tasting it after the first month. My station was in Junction 47, a cramped chamber deep in the port engineering section, where 17 plasma conduits intersected in a web of ceramite piping that required constant monitoring. The temperature there averaged 45 degrees Celsius, even when the conduits were running cool, and the ozone smell was strong enough to make your eyes water during the first hour of each shift. 3 other ratings worked that junction with me. Corpsman David Ireland, who had served for 12 years and spoken grunts more often than words. Rating First Class Mikhail Korvan, who talked constantly about the agri-world he came from and the wheat fields he would never see again. And rating Third Class Orin Hess, who was 19 years old and had been aboard for only 3 months. Still soft enough to believe that his service mattered. We had been at our station for 2 hours when the first alarm sounded. Not the general quarters klaxon that would have sent the entire ship to battle stations, but a localized alert that indicated an anomaly in the upper decks. Through the Vox system, I heard the officer of the watch calling for security teams to report to the starboard docking bay. His voice carried a note of confusion rather than alarm. Someone had apparently detected an unauthorized access signature, possibly a malfunctioning door mechanism or a servitor that had wandered outside its designated zone. Routine. Mundane. The kind of minor irregularity that happens on ships this old, where ancient systems occasionally behave in ways that defy their programming. Mikhail made a joke about servitors developing independence. Dave grunted something that might have been laughter. Oren continued monitoring his pressure gauge with the intense focus of someone still trying to prove his worth. I recorded the alarm in our station log because regulations required documentation of all ship-wide Vox traffic, even the meaningless fragments. The chronometer read 0847 hours ship time. I remember that detail with absolute clarity because 23 minutes later, the screaming began. It started in the upper decks, distant enough that it reached us as an echo through ventilation shafts and corridor acoustics. The Vox system erupted with fragmented transmissions, security teams calling for reinforcements, officers demanding situation reports, voices rising in pitch as confusion transformed into panic. I heard the words "hostile boarding" before the transmission dissolved into static. I heard someone scream about giants in crimson armor before last fire drowned out the rest. I heard Captain Vaughan's voice cut through the chaos, commanding all hands to battle stations, ordering bulkhead seals activated, demanding that every rating arm themselves and prepare to repel boarders. The general quarters klaxon began its wailing shriek, a sound designed to pierce through even the reactor noise and reach every compartment of the ship. Red emergency lighting activated automatically, transforming the familiar amber corridors into something alien and threatening. Dave moved immediately toward the weapons locker that each major station maintained. Las guns for the ratings, a single plasma pistol for the corpsman, and las pistols for backup. Mikhail's face had gone white beneath the grime and sweat that marked all of us who worked the deep engineering sections. Oren looked at me with eyes that asked questions I couldn't answer. "Could be pirates," David said, his voice steady as he distributed the lascans. "Could be Xenos. Could be." The Vox system erupted with a sound I had never heard before. Something between a scream and a laugh, distorted by helmet Vox grills and amplified to volumes that made the speakers crackle. Then came the bolter fire. Even through the Vox's degraded audio, the distinctive explosive bark of bolt guns was unmistakable. Each shot sounded like a small thunderclap, and they came in rapid succession, dozens of them, hundreds, an orchestra of violence that painted a picture more vivid than any visual transmission could have provided. "Traitor Marines," Mikhail whispered. "Emperor preserve us." Those are Astartes. I felt my hands begin to shake as I took the lasgun David handed me. I had trained with these weapons during my initial naval indoctrination, 6 weeks of drilling on how to hold them, aim them, fire them at targets that didn't move or shoot back. I had qualified as adequate, which meant I could hit a stationary target at 20 meters perhaps 60% of the time. My training had never covered how to face post-human warriors clad in power armor that could shrug off las fire the way I might ignore raindrops. My indoctrination sermons had mentioned Chaos Space Marines as bogeymen, traitors from the ancient heresy who had abandoned the Emperor's light and embraced the ruinous powers. The priests described them as fallen angels, corrupted monsters, enemies of everything humanity held sacred. They never mentioned how to kill one. If you've made it this far into this nightmare, if you're beginning to understand what we faced, leave the word witnessed in the comments. Their story deserves to be remembered, even if the Imperium would prefer to forget we ever existed. The Vox transmissions became increasingly fragmented over the next hour. We listened as security teams reported contact and then went silent. We heard armsmen calling for heavy weapons, then screaming as those heavy weapons apparently proved inadequate. We tracked the border's progress through the ship not by any coherent reporting, but by following the trail of terminated Vox signals as station after station, compartment after compartment, stopped transmitting. They were moving downward through the decks, methodically clearing each level with a thoroughness that suggested this was not a hasty raid, but a deliberate, leisurely slaughter. Captain Vaughan's voice cut through the chaos at 0934 hours, his command training allowing him to maintain composure even as his ship died around him. He announced that the borders numbered approximately 10 hostiles, 10 Chaos Space Marines who had apparently teleported directly into the starboard docking bay through means our auger arrays had failed to detect. He confirmed they were cutting through security teams and bulkhead barriers as though neither existed. He ordered all engineering personnel to maintain their stations and prepare for potential reactor shutdown if the borders reached the engineering decks. He invoked the Emperor's name and called for faith and courage. He didn't tell us we were going to die, but his tone made it clear that he knew we would. The mathematics were brutally simple. 10 Chaos Space Marines versus 8,000 crew. Under any rational analysis, 8,000 armed humans should overwhelm 10 opponents regardless of individual capability. But Chaos Space Marines aren't bound by rational analysis. They are post-human killing machines, standing over 2 meters tall in their corrupted power armor, wielding weapons designed to slaughter enemies in numbers. Enhanced by genetic modification that makes them faster and stronger than any baseline human could ever hope to be. And more than that, more terrible than their physical capabilities. They had been doing this for longer than most of our crew had been alive. Some traitor Marines had fought in the heresy itself, 10,000 years of experience translating into a casual expertise in murder that made our desperate resistance into a darkly comic performance. At 10:15 hours, the borders reached Deck 7, 3 levels above our position. The Vox carried a transmission from that deck's security commander, a veteran armsman named Sergeant Kellick, who I had met once during a cross-training exercise. His voice remained steady as he reported that the traitor Marines were advancing down the central corridor in a standard line formation, not taking cover, seemingly unconcerned by the last fire that hundreds of crew were pouring into them. He described their armor, crimson ceramite, decorated with brass symbols that hurt to look at directly, covered in chains and trophies that included what appeared to be human remains. He described their weapons, oversized bolt guns that fired mass reactive shells capable of tearing through bulkheads, chain swords longer than a man's arm that screamed as they carved through flesh and metal equally. Then he described their laughter. They were laughing as they killed. Not the manic cackling of madness, but genuine amusement, the way someone might laugh at a particularly clever joke or an unexpectedly entertaining performance. Each time they cut down another group of defenders, each time a bolter shell reduced a human body to an explosion of meat and bone fragments, I could hear it through the Vox, deep, resonant laughter amplified by their helmet systems into something that carried through the entire ship like a chorus of damned things celebrating their damnation. Sergeant Kellick's transmission ended mid-sentence. The Vox emitted a wet, tearing sound, then cut to static. Dave had positioned himself at the entrance to our junction, his lasgun trained on the corridor beyond. Mikhail had wedged himself behind a support pillar with a clear line of sight to the access ladder that descended from the deck above. Oren stood near the plasma conduits, his weapon shaking in his hands badly enough that I worried he might accidentally fire into the machinery we were supposed to protect. I took up position near the secondary entrance, a maintenance hatch that provided access from the adjacent section, and tried to control my breathing enough to aim properly. The ship had gone strangely quiet. The general quarters klaxon had stopped at some point. Perhaps disabled by damage, perhaps turned off by someone in command who realized its constant shrieking served no purpose except to mark the pace of our dying. The plasma conduits hummed their usual song, indifferent to the violence occurring in the decks above us. Through the bulkheads, I could feel the vibration of the ship's systems continuing their functions, because machines don't stop working just because their human components are being slaughtered. The air tasted of recycled fear, that particular combination of sweat and adrenaline that you can actually smell when enough people are terrified in enclosed spaces. At 11:47 hours, 3 hours after the boarding began, the Vox crackled with a new voice. Not the captain, not any officer I recognized. This voice sounded wrong, too deep, too resonant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well, while simultaneously standing next to you. The words came in Gothic, but the accent carried inflections that suggested it was not the speaker's native tongue, that Gothic was merely a convenience, a language chosen to ensure we understood our doom. "Little mortals," the voice said, each word separated by a pause that felt calculated for dramatic effect. "Your captain has sealed himself on the bridge, with perhaps 2,000 of you. He believes his bulkheads will save him. He believes we intend to capture this vessel. He understands nothing. We came here to hunt, not to conquer. We came here because it has been too long since we heard humans scream, and your deaths will serve as entertainment." The Vox hissed with static, then carried that laughter again. Multiple voices this time, a choir of traitor Marines apparently finding the situation hilarious. "We have killed 6,000 of you in 4 hours. The remaining 2,000 present a dilemma. Do we slaughter you quickly and end our sport? Or do we slow down, savor each kill, make this last?" My brothers are debating this question with great enthusiasm. Mikhail made a sound that might have been a sob or a prayer. Dave's hands tightened on his lasgun, knuckles going white with pressure. Oren had sunk to the floor, his weapon forgotten beside him, eyes focused on nothing. I felt something cold and heavy settle into my stomach. Not fear exactly, but a kind of dreadful understanding that nothing we did would matter. They weren't here to accomplish a military objective. They weren't trying to capture the ship or steal our cargo or assassinate our officers. They had boarded us for sport, for entertainment. 8,000 people were dying because 10 traitor Marines had decided we would provide amusing prey. The voice continued, "We have decided to extend your suffering. 1 hour for the remaining prey. 1 hour to run, to hide, to pray to your corpse god and discover that he doesn't answer. Then we will come for you, and we will make your deaths last as long as we can keep you alive to experience them. The hunt begins now." The Vox went silent. 60 minutes, 3,600 seconds. That was how long we had to live. Dave turned to look at us, his face carved from stone by a lifetime of naval service that had prepared him for many forms of death, but not this. "We defend this position," he said. "Regulations require—" "Regulations don't account for traitor Marines," I interrupted. "Defending this junction against those things is suicide. Then we die at our posts like proper ratings," David said, but his voice carried no conviction. Mikhail spoke up, his words tumbling over each other in panicked rushes. The cargo holds. There are chemical storage sections in the lower holds where the bulkheads are thicker, where maybe we could hide long enough for what? For rescue that's not coming? For the captain to defeat them somehow? The captain is sealed on the bridge with what remains of his command crew, I said. He's not defeating anything. He's waiting to die behind thicker walls. So, what do you suggest? Dave asked, and I heard the authority draining from his voice as his 12 years of service confronted something that experience couldn't address. We run, I said. We find the deepest, most remote section of this ship we can reach in 60 minutes, and we hide and we pray they don't find us before they grow bored and leave. The Emperor protects, Oren whispered from his position on the floor. The Emperor isn't here, I said, and saying it felt like blasphemy and honesty simultaneously. We're alone with monsters who are hunting us for fun. The only protection we have is whatever we can manage ourselves. If you think they deserved better than this, better than being prey for corrupted monsters, let your engagement be the memorial the Imperium never gave them. Like and subscribe so their deaths mean something. We moved through the lower engineering decks like rats fleeing a sinking ship, which was appropriate because that's essentially what we had become. Vermin trying to avoid predators. The corridors had emptied as crew either ran for imagined safety or hunkered down at their stations to await death with a pretense of duty. We encountered small groups of other ratings, eyes wide with terror, clutching lasguns or improvised weapons like wrenches and pry bars that would be useless against power-armored giants. No one was in command. No one had a plan. The chain of authority had dissolved when the reality of our situation became clear. You can't court-martial the dead, and we were all already dead, just waiting for the moment when that theoretical state became concrete. I led our small group deeper into the port engineering section, descending through maintenance corridors and service shafts that most crew never accessed during routine operations. These spaces existed for emergency repairs, for accessing systems that the tech priests preferred to keep hidden from general view, for storing components and materials that didn't fit in the regular supply chain. The air grew hotter as we descended. 50 degrees, then 55, the heat radiating from reactor conduits and plasma manifolds that channeled energies capable of vaporizing us if containment ever failed. The ozone smell intensified until it became a taste, coating the inside of your mouth with metallic bitterness. Sodium lamps gave way to emergency lumens that cast harsh white light at irregular intervals, creating pools of brightness separated by stretches of shadow. At 12:23 hours, we found what I hoped would serve as our hiding place, a storage chamber in the deepest accessible level of the engineering section. Surrounded by redundant bulkheads and positioned between two major support structures that would make it difficult to reach without knowing the chamber existed. The space measured approximately 4 meters by 6 meters, packed with equipment lockers and component bins that had probably been forgotten by anyone who originally placed them there. The temperature inside registered 58 degrees Celsius, according to the environmental sensor near the entrance. There was one access hatch, which we could seal and hopefully reinforce. Dave, Mikhail, Oren, and I squeezed into that chamber and began the desperate work of fortifying our hiding place. We dragged equipment lockers to block the hatch, welded them together with a plasma torch Mikhail had grabbed during our flight, and stacked component bins behind the lockers to create multiple layers of barrier. It was futile work. Power-armored fists could tear through our improvised fortification in seconds, but doing something felt better than sitting idle while counting down the minutes until our hunters found us. The Vox system still functioned in our hiding place, which meant we could hear the massacre continuing in the decks above us. The traitor Marines had kept their promise about extending the hunt. Rather than killing quickly, they were taking their time, apparently pursuing individual crew members through the corridors, letting their prey run and hide before inevitably finding them. The Vox carried fragments of these hunts, desperate screaming, mocking laughter, the revving of chain swords, the explosive bark of bolters firing single shots rather than full automatic, as though the traitor Marines were deliberately conserving ammunition to make the sport last longer. At 13:01 hours, I heard a voice I recognized. Ensign Harak, a junior officer who had conducted some of my technical training when I first joined the undaunting resolve. He was begging. The words poured through the vox in a stream of pleading. He had a family on Scintilla. He had served for 11 years. He would do anything, anything. Please, please don't, please. The chainsaw drowned out the rest. The vox carried wet, tearing sounds punctuated by Ensign Harak's screaming that went on for approximately 35 seconds before ending abruptly. Then came that laughter again, and a voice saying, "That one was disappointing. The next should provide better sport." Mikkel vomited in the corner of our hiding place, adding the smell of bile to the existing cocktail of heat and ozone and fear. Oren had curled into himself against the far wall, hands pressed over his ears, eyes squeezed shut, as though not seeing and not hearing might somehow protect him. Dave sat with his back to the barricaded hatch, Laskin across his lap, face expressionless in the way that men adopt when they've moved beyond fear into a kind of numb acceptance. I monitored the chronometer. 37 minutes remaining. The traitor Marines were methodical in their hunting. They moved through the ship section by section, deck by deck, clearing each area before advancing to the next. Through the vox, I could track their progress by following the pattern of screams and weapons fire. They worked inward from the outer hull toward the ship's core, driving the surviving crew before them like game birds being pushed toward waiting guns. Anyone who tried to hide was eventually found. Anyone who tried to fight was casually slaughtered. Anyone who tried to run was hunted down and killed in ways that suggested the traitor Marines were competing to see who could make deaths last longest. At 13:34 hours, a transmission cut through the vox that carried such raw agony that I felt it as a physical sensation in my chest. Someone, I never learned who, had been captured alive and was being worked on. The traitor Marines were discussing the human body's capacity to sustain damage while maintaining consciousness, conducting a practical demonstration that they narrated in clinical detail. They described removing limbs. They described using combat knives heated by power armor systems to cauterize wounds and prevent death by blood loss. They described how many bones in the human skeleton could be broken before cardiac arrest occurred from the shock. The victim's screaming provided experimental data. It lasted for 6 minutes and 43 seconds before going silent. "In the name of the lost and damned," one of the traitor Marines said after the victim died, his tone suggesting genuine disappointment. That one couldn't even survive a complete skeletal survey. "These mortals are so fragile." Another voice, different but equally inhuman. "The next group should prove more durable." I sense considerable fear from the lower engineering sections. Fear makes the body release chemicals that enhance pain response. The specimens down there should provide more satisfying results. They were coming for us. They knew we were hiding in the engineering sections. They could apparently sense our fear through some warp-touched ability that defied rational understanding. Mikkel started praying. Real prayers, not the casual invocations that crew muttered before meals or shifts. He recited litanies I had heard during the ship's weekly devotionals, calling on the Emperor to deliver us from evil, to protect the faithful, to strike down the traitors who had abandoned his light. The words tumbled from his mouth in an increasingly frantic stream, voice rising in pitch as terror overwhelmed whatever composure he had maintained. His prayers filled our hiding place with sound that felt like accusation, because we all knew the Emperor wasn't listening, wasn't coming, wasn't going to save us from anything. "Mikkel," I said quietly, "stop. The Emperor protects," he insisted, eyes wide and wet. "If we maintain faith, if we prove ourselves worthy, he will do nothing," I said, and the words tasted like ash. "Look around. 8,000 crew, most of them faithful servants who prayed daily and followed every regulation and trusted that their devotion mattered. They're dead or dying while monsters laugh. The Emperor doesn't protect. He never has. We're alone with our fear and about." I checked the chronometer. 11 minutes until they find us. "Then we fight," David said, his voice carrying a note of finality. We die like Imperial ratings, not cowering rats. We die like prey, I corrected. That's all we've ever been to them. That's all any of us are. Prey that happens to be self-aware enough to know we're being hunted. Oren made a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been the last fragment of his sanity breaking. My father told me, he said, his voice distant and disconnected, that naval service was honorable, that I would serve the Imperium and protect humanity from threats beyond our understanding. He was so proud when I was accepted into the press gang's quota. I never told him it wasn't acceptance. I was just tall enough and young enough and healthy enough to meet their requirements. He thought I was chosen, special. He looked at me with eyes that had aged decades in the past hours. I'm going to die because 10 bored monsters decided to hunt our ship for entertainment. There's no honor in this, no purpose. I'm dying for nothing. We're all dying for nothing, I said. That's the only truth the Imperium ever taught us that turned out to be accurate. The Vox crackled at 13:41 hours with a new transmission. Captain Vaughan's voice, strained but controlled, speaking from the sealed bridge. To all surviving crew of the Undaunting Resolve, I have initiated the ship's self-destruct sequence. Reactor overload will occur in 4 minutes. The Emperor protects, and we will deny these traitors their sport by choosing our own deaths. Serve with pride, die with honor. The Emperor. An explosion cut off the transmission. Not the reactor overload that would have vaporized the entire ship instantly. This sounded like a breaching charge, followed by bolter fire, followed by screaming that I recognized as the captain's voice. The traitor Marines had breached the bridge. They had reached Captain Vaughan and his command crew with 4 minutes remaining before the reactor overload would destroy the ship. They didn't stop the self-destruct. They didn't seem concerned about dying in the explosion. Instead, they spent those final 4 minutes conducting one last hunt, killing the bridge crew in ways that made the previous deaths sound merciful by comparison. The Vox carried every moment, the begging, the screaming, the laughter, the casual conversation between traitor Marines, discussing techniques and comparing kill counts like hunters reviewing a successful expedition. At 13:44 hours, a voice cut through the carnage on the bridge. This has been adequate sport, brothers. The prey was weak, but numerous enough to provide several hours of entertainment. We should depart before the reactor tears this ship apart. Agreed, another voice responded, though I confess disappointment that so few showed real spirit. They died like cattle, bleating and afraid. Perhaps the next hunt will provide better prey. I have heard reports of an Astartes chapter recruiting world in this sector. The initiates there might actually fight back. Laughter. Multiple voices joining in shared amusement at some joke only they understood. Then silence. Not the silence of ended transmission, but the absolute silence of absent presence. They had left, teleported away with the same warp-touch technology that had brought them, returning to whatever damned ship had delivered them to our location. We had 2 minutes before the reactor overload killed everyone they had left alive. Dave moved first, tearing away the barricade we had built with strength born of desperate hope. Emergency escape pods, he said, hauling aside equipment lockers. Deck 3, starboard side. If we run, if we move faster than we've ever moved, it's 4 decks up, Mikhail said, but he was already moving, following David through the hatch. Oren looked at me, and I saw the question in his eyes. Was there any point? Even if we reached the pods, even if we managed to launch before the reactor overload, we would be adrift in the void with limited supplies and no guarantee of rescue. We would die slowly instead of instantly. Was that better? Move, I told him, because dying slowly at least meant more time to exist, and existing seemed valuable when the alternative was immediate cessation. We ran through corridors that had become alien landscapes of heat and shadow. The ship's systems were already failing as the reactor overload began its cascade. Lighting flickered, bulkheads groaned as structural supports lost power. The ambient hum that had been the Undaunting Resolve's constant song began wavering into discordant notes. We encountered other survivors making the same desperate flight, dozens of crew, all heading toward the same theoretical salvation, all knowing it was probably futile, but unable to simply accept death while any alternative existed. The evidence of the traitor Marine's hunt littered our path. Bodies that had been torn apart with casual brutality, bulkheads scarred by chainsword cuts, blood painting the walls in patterns that suggested some victims had been killed while trying to crawl away. The smell of death hung heavy enough to taste, meat left in heat too long, chemical sweetness of coagulating blood, acrid smoke from last burns and promethium residue. We reached Deck 4 at 13:45 hours, 45 seconds remaining according to the ship's chronometer that counted down our deaths with mechanical precision. One more deck to go. One more access ladder to climb. Dave went first, his Navy training overriding any instinct towards self-preservation, hauling himself up the ladder with arms that had loaded torpedo casings for 12 years. Mikhail followed, moving with surprising agility for someone who usually complained about physical exertion. Orin climbed next, and I brought up the rear, my hands slipping on ladder rungs made slick by sweat and blood. 30 seconds. We emerged onto Deck 3 into chaos. Perhaps 300 crew had reached this level, all converging on the escape pod bays, all pushing and shoving and fighting for access to survival capsules designed to hold maybe 20 people each. Naval discipline had completely disintegrated. Ratings were striking officers who tried to maintain order. Officers were abandoning their posts to save themselves. Everyone had become reduced to animal desperation. I saw a commissar trying to shoot crew who were pushing past him, but his bolt pistol jammed after the first shot, and the crowd trampled him before he could clear the malfunction. 20 seconds. Dave forced his way toward Pod Bay 7, using his size and strength to create a path that the rest of us could follow. Mikhail clung to his back like a child clinging to a parent. Orin grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, pulling me along in their wake. Around us, the ship began the final stages of its death. Metal screaming as structural elements failed, atmosphere venting through microfractures in the hull, the deep thrumming of the reactor building toward criticality. 15 seconds. We reached a pod. Pod 7 Delta according to the stencil designation, just as its interior reached capacity. 20 crew packed into a space meant for 20, no room for 4 more. The hatch beginning to cycle closed as someone inside triggered the launch sequence. Dave grabbed the hatch, holding it open through sheer force despite the hydraulics trying to seal it, screaming at the crew inside to make room, to show mercy, to remember their oaths of service and solidarity. 10 seconds. Someone inside the pod shot David. A last pistol round that hit him in the chest, not fatal but stunning enough that his grip on the hatch failed. The hydraulics slammed the hatch shut. Through the viewport I could see faces pressed against the glass. Fellow crew members I had served beside for years, now staring at us with expressions that mixed guilt and relief that they were inside and we were outside. 5 seconds. The pod launched, explosive bolts firing it clear of the dying ship. I felt the vibration through the deck plating as multiple pods fired simultaneously. 300 crew members escaping in 15 pods, while 8,000 total had served aboard this vessel. The mathematics of survival are brutal and simple. 3 seconds. Mikhail was praying again, hands clasped together, eyes closed, words flowing in a desperate stream. Orin had sunk to his knees, face blank, apparently past fear, into some place beyond emotion. I stood watching the chronometer, thinking about my mother and her textile manufactorum on Scintilla, wondering if she was still alive, knowing she would never learn what happened to me. 1 second. The reactor overload began in the engineering decks, precisely where we had been hiding minutes before. The plasma containment failed catastrophically, releasing energies that had been constrained by blessed machinery and tech priest rituals. Those energies converted matter into plasma, expanding outward at speeds that approached light itself. The undaunting resolve, 90 years of imperial service, 1.6 kilometers of blessed steel and sanctified systems, transformed into a brief star that burned brightly enough to be visible from several astronomical units away. I should have died instantly. We all should have died instantly. The crew on Deck 3, the ratings who hadn't reached the escape pods, everyone who remained aboard when the reactor overload occurred. Instant vaporization, consciousness snuffed out too quickly for pain or fear or final thoughts. But the universe, I have learned, is not kind. The explosion propagated unevenly through the ship's structure, following paths of least resistance, flowing around support structures, and through corridors like water finding the lowest ground. The section of Deck 3 where we stood was, by pure statistical improbability, one of the last areas to be consumed. We had approximately 2.3 seconds between the moment the reactor failed and the moment the plasma wave reached our position. 2.3 seconds is an eternity when you're dying, long enough to see the bulkheads begin glowing with heat transmitted through metal, long enough to feel your skin start to burn from thermal radiation, long enough to understand exactly what is happening and know you cannot stop it, long enough to hear Mikhail's prayers turn into screaming, long enough to watch Oren's hair ignite, long enough to realize that the traitor Marines' promise of extended suffering had been truthful in ways they probably never intended. We weren't dying quickly. We were burning alive with enough time to comprehend our burning. I opened my mouth to scream and inhaled superheated air that scorched my lungs. The pain was absolute, every nerve ending firing simultaneously, overwhelming consciousness with pure sensation. My last thought before the plasma wave vaporized me was a strange detachment, wondering if this was what Ensign Horrocks had felt during those 35 seconds under the chainsword. If this all-consuming agony represented the universal experience of death, the final truth that united every living thing. Then I was gone. Matthias Krenn, 22 years old, rating 3rd class, son of a textile worker, servant of the Imperium, reduced to plasma and free atoms and scattered energy that dissipated into the void. Except I didn't stop being aware. Consciousness persisted past the moment when my body ceased to exist, past the moment when the physical substrate that should have contained my thoughts was converted to plasma. For a period of time I cannot measure, seconds or hours or days, time having lost meaning without a body to experience its passage. I existed as pure awareness, scattered across the expanding debris field that had been the undaunting resolve. I could sense the escape pods, 15 small vessels carrying 300 survivors away from the explosion. I could sense their relief mixed with guilt, their gratitude mixed with horror, their survival carrying the weight of 8,000 deaths. I could sense something else, something vast and cold and utterly indifferent, watching the destruction with the casual interest of a child observing insects burn under focused sunlight. The presence I felt was not warp-touched like the Chaos Marines. This was something else, something that existed in the material universe, but operated on scales that made human consciousness irrelevant. I understood, in that moment of impossible awareness, that we had all been sacrificial offerings to something that fed on death, not because it was evil, but because that was simply its nature, the way a fire feeds on oxygen without moral judgment. Then even that awareness faded, consciousness finally surrendering to the physics that should have destroyed it immediately. I experienced a moment of profound relief that felt almost like peace. Finally, true death, true ending, true escape from the nightmare of existence. But the universe, as I have mentioned, is not kind. I woke in an administrative Medicaid station 6 weeks later, one of 63 survivors recovered from the escape pods that had been retrieved by a passing patrol frigate. My body had been reconstructed from the severe burns and radiation damage I had sustained in those final seconds before the explosion consumed me. My lungs had been replaced with augmatic systems. My skin had been regrown in vats and grafted over synthetic flesh substitutes. My eyes had been replaced with basic optical implants that provided vision, but none of the subtle processing that natural eyes perform. I was alive, technically, sustained by machinery and chemical cocktails that prevented my augmetics from being rejected by what little original tissue remained. They told me I was lucky. They told me the Emperor protects. They told me I would return to service once my physical rehabilitation was complete, that my survival proved my worth to the Imperium, that I should be grateful for the opportunity to continue serving. No one asked about the 8,000 who died. No one conducted an investigation into how Chaos Marines had boarded an Imperial frigate and killed for sport. No one seemed concerned that 10 traitors had destroyed an entire ship and crew just for entertainment. The Administratum logged the undaunting resolve as destroyed by reactor malfunction. An unfortunate accident, a mechanical failure, nothing more. Captain Vaughan and his crew became a casualty statistic, a data point in some ledger that tracked Imperial losses without ever asking why those losses occurred. I served for 3 more years after my recovery. They assigned me to a supply station in the Calixis sector, where I processed requisition forms and monitored inventory databases, contributing to the vast machine of Imperial logistics in ways so abstract that I never saw the results of my work. My augmetic lungs required maintenance every 6 weeks. My synthetic skin developed rashes that needed chemical treatment. My optical implants occasionally glitched, replacing my vision with static or strange colors that had no names. I existed, but I had stopped living the moment the undaunting resolve exploded. During those 3 years, I learned that our experience was not unique. Chaos Marine raids happened throughout Imperial space with enough frequency that the Imperium had standardized procedures for dealing with them. Ships disappeared, stations went silent, entire populations vanished under circumstances that official reports attributed to mechanical failures or navigational errors, or administrative oversights. The truth was that the Imperium's enemies treated humanity as prey, and the Imperium's response was to hide that truth behind bureaucratic language and blame inanimate systems, rather than admit that its citizens were being hunted for sport. I learned that the 8,000 dead from the undaunting resolve were a small number compared to typical casualties. I learned that Chaos Marines sometimes killed millions during their raids. I learned that some raids lasted for months, traitors amusing themselves by keeping populations alive and afraid, conducting hunts that became legendary among the ruinous power's followers. I learned that no amount of prayer or faith or devotion provided any protection, that the Emperor's divine intervention was a myth sustained because admitting the truth would destroy the very foundations of Imperial society. I learned that I hated the Imperium, not the passionate hatred that drives rebels and heretics, but the code. Exhausted hatred of someone who has seen behind the curtain and discovered that the magnificent facade hides nothing but machinery that grinds people into component parts and uses them up without thought or remorse. 3 years after the undaunting resolve died, I requested discharge from Imperial service. They granted it because augmetic-dependent crew are expensive to maintain, and I had reached the point where my replacement costs less than my continued employment. They gave me a discharge stipend that would last perhaps 6 months if I was careful. They gave me a certification of service that entitled me to certain minor benefits from planetary governments that bothered to honor such things. They gave me a handshake and a blessing, and sent me to find whatever life could be built from the wreckage of what I had been. I returned to Scintilla, to Hive Tertius, to the mid-levels where I had been born. My mother had died while I was aboard the undaunting resolve. Lung failure, the inevitable result of 3 decades breathing chemical fog. No one had notified me. No one had considered that information worth transmitting across the sector. She was buried in the communal crematoriums that processed the Hive's endless dead, her ashes mixed with millions of others, anonymous and forgotten. I found work in a manufactorum that produced components for Imperial Navy vessels, a bitter irony that I was building parts for the same ships that had consumed my life. The work was monotonous and meaningless, but that suited me. I had no ambitions. I had no purpose beyond continuing to exist, because the alternative to existence required an active decision, and I couldn't summon the energy to make it. This cycle has repeated across the Imperium for 10,000 years. Crew members serving on ships that become targets for bored traitors. Survivors carrying guilt and trauma that never heals. The machine grinding forward regardless of individual suffering. If you believe this cycle deserves recognition, that these deaths matter even if the Imperium pretends they don't, leave eternal in the comments. I have lived with the memories of the undaunting Resolve's final hours for 17 years now. The nightmares have faded but never disappeared. I still wake sometimes hearing Mikhail's prayers, still see Orin's blank expression in those final seconds, still feel the burning in my lungs as I inhaled superheated air. The augmetics that keep me alive are failing gradually, breaking down in ways that the local Medicaid facilities cannot properly repair. My synthetic lungs are operating at perhaps 60% capacity. My optical implants have developed permanent artifacts that overlay everything I see with static and distortion. I am dying slowly, which is appropriate because everyone dies slowly in the Imperium. Some deaths just take longer than others. I am writing this because someone should remember what actually happened to the undaunting Resolve. Someone should know that 8,000 people didn't die in a reactor malfunction, but were hunted by monsters who killed for entertainment. Someone should understand that the Imperium's protection is a lie, that faith provides no safety, that serving with honor and devotion means nothing when your enemies treat you as prey. The traitor Marines who boarded our ship probably don't remember us. We were a few hours of sport, forgettable among countless other raids they have conducted across millennia. They moved on to other hunts, other prey, other victims who died believing their service mattered. But I remember them. I remember their laughter. I remember the casual cruelty with which they murdered thousands of people who had committed no crime except being convenient targets. I remember standing on Deck 3 watching the chronometer count down our deaths. I remember understanding that we were dying for nothing, that our deaths would be recorded as accidents, that no one would mourn us beyond the immediate grief of family and friends, who would themselves eventually die and take their memories with them. I remember feeling the thermal radiation begin to burn my skin and thinking that this was the truth behind all Imperial propaganda. We are meat, we exist to be consumed, and the manner of our consumption is the only variable. The Emperor doesn't protect, he never has. They told us otherwise to keep us compliant, to ensure we would serve without questioning why our service required such suffering. But the truth is visible to anyone who looks honestly at the Imperium's reality. We are alone in a universe filled with things that want to kill us, and our supposed protectors are either unable or unwilling to actually protect us from anything that matters. 8,000 crew members of the undaunting Resolve learned this truth in their final hours. Most are forgotten now, their names lost to administrative indifference and the passage of time. But they existed. They had lives and histories and dreams that were cut short because 10 bored monsters wanted entertainment. They deserve more than bureaucratic footnotes and casualty statistics. They deserve to be witnessed, to be remembered, to have their story told honestly rather than hidden behind convenient lies about reactor malfunctions. This is that story. This is the truth the Imperium would prefer to suppress, that its citizens are prey, that monsters hunt them for sport, that no amount of faith or service provides any protection from the universe's fundamental cruelty. This is what a Chaos Space Marine boarding action actually means. Hundreds or thousands of people dying in terror while their killers laugh. Death extended for entertainment. Suffering maximized because suffering amuses immortal predators who have forgotten how to value life. This is reality in the 41st millennium. This is what service to the Imperium actually costs. This is why I hate them, not just the Chaos Marines who killed my comrades, but the Imperium itself that created the conditions where such raids are routine enough to have standardized procedures, where 8,000 deaths are a minor statistic, where truth is buried because acknowledging it would threaten the machine's continued function. I am dying slowly in a manufactorum on Scintilla, building components for ships that will carry other crews to similar fates. My augmatic lungs labor with each breath. My synthetic skin itches constantly where it interfaces with dying organic tissue. My optical implants show me a world overlaid with static and distortion, which seems appropriate because the world itself is distorted, truth obscured by layers of propaganda and institutional lies. In perhaps 5 years, maybe 10 if I'm unlucky, my augmetics will fail completely and I will die for the second time. There will be no memorial. No one will remember Matthias Kren, beyond perhaps a few fellow workers who will forget me within weeks of my death. I will be cremated in the communal furnaces like my mother was, my ashes mixed with countless others, anonymous and forgotten. But before I die, I wanted someone to know what happened aboard the Undaunting Resolve. I wanted the truth recorded somewhere beyond administrative lies and statistical abstractions. I wanted those 8,000 deaths to mean something, even if that meaning is only that their suffering was witnessed and remembered by at least one person who survived. They told us the Emperor protects. They lied. They told us service was honorable. They lied. They told us our deaths would matter. They lied. The only truth I learned from my time in the Imperial Navy is this: we are meat for the grinder, and the grinder is eternal, and the best we can hope for is that our deaths will be quick rather than extended. The 8,000 who died aboard the Undaunting Resolve were denied even that mercy. They died slowly, in terror, hunted by laughing monsters who treated their suffering as entertainment. Now you know what actually lies beneath the Imperium's promises of protection and purpose. Now you understand what boarding action actually means when the boarders are Chaos Space Marines who came not to conquer, but to hunt. Now you've witnessed the truth that the administration buries in technical language and false reports. If any part of this has moved you, if you think these deaths deserve recognition beyond what the Imperium provided, subscribe to ensure their story endures. The Emperor protects, they say. But no one protected the 8,000 who died for entertainment. No one is protecting you either. Knowledge costs. Now you've paid the price. Now you know what terror actually means when monsters decide your prey. Now you understand why I still wake screaming 17 years later. Now you know.